live online for Wednesday, February 10th, 2021. We are live both for those who are participants and those who are watching through our channels, our webcast channels. We do this, Broadband Breakfast Live Online. I'm Drew Clark, editor and publisher of Broadband Breakfast. We do this every Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern Time. Today, we are going to have the final session of our 6-part series, A No-Nonsense Guide to 5G, sponsored by Samsung Electronics America. We're really excited about this program we're going to have over the next 59 minutes. Before I lean into the program, I want to remind our audience that we will be here again next week for a session on rural broadband innovation on February 17th. And on February 24th, we're going to tackle some issues about the consumer welfare standard and antitrust and how it impacts some of the cases against the big tech platforms. Before, though, again, I turn to our great audience of 2 engineers and a policy person who I guess practices as if he were an engineer. I want to just give a little context, back up and talk about some of the things we've been through as we've talked about this no-nonsense guide to 5G. We started off the sessions back in October with the topic of the hype and the reality of 5G. And that's what we've tried to do in the 5 sessions we've had and this one here to get at both what is actual and what could be the next steps for this technology as it moves forward. The second one, October 28th, we tackled some of the issues with national security, supply chain. In the popular mind, those are almost synonymous and linked, right? 5G and the race with China, right? And there's substance behind it. There's been a huge change in in America's policies vis-a-vis national security, vis-a-vis China over the last 18 months. And so that's a reality that we have to deal with as we talk about the policy issues associated with 5G. We also covered business uses, the enterprise, and we called it the case study of transformative apps in the enterprise on November 18th. That session dealt with kind of some of the first places we're seeing 5G evolution categories and successes. And then we had a bit of a spirited debate on December 9th where we talked about some of the issues about rights of way, because that is one thing we're going to need more and more of. And I know we're going to talk about this today, about digital antenna systems, small cells, how much more systems need to be out there than in prior versions, prior evolutionary stages of this technology. And so that's also raises some policy questions. And then the last session we had just 2 weeks ago was on adoption and use of 5G broadband, which kind of broadened our perspective a little bit to some of the issues that lots of people are left out right now. A lot of people left out on the other side of the broadband digital divide, but maybe even a 5G divide. And how do we kind of get ahead of that and avoid problems from that in the future? So today, of course, we're going to be talking about spectrum policies to advance better broadband. And for our description, of course, as you can read, where we have the bios for our panelists, we do talk about how there's spectrum issues in the lower bands, right? Like we're talking 600, 800 megahertz, and we'll go through more about these spectrum ranges and categories with our expert guests. But also the mid-band. There's been a lot of focus on mid-band issues, which we're talking sort of in the 3.4 gigahertz to 6 gigahertz range. And yet, one of the big promises that I certainly have been hearing and feeling about 5G is the super high capacity throughputs. And those are available when you can tap into higher spectrum ranges, 24 gigahertz to 100 gigahertz. So these millimeter wave bands, we basically tapped my extent of my knowledge, but we certainly haven't tapped the extent of knowledge of our guests. And so with that longish introduction, I want to now open it up to our 3 panelists on changing the view so we can all see each other. Our guests today are Dr. Robert Kubik, who is Senior Director of Public Policy for Samsung Electronics America. I said to him, we didn't have this photo of you for the preview, so it's a pre-COVID photo. So what a year can do to you, right? So we're very excited to hear from Dr. Kubik, who's kind of been in the spectrum wars for his entire career, and he's going to kind of give us the first lay of the land, the first overview of some of the spectrum issues and how they apply to 5G. He'll be followed by Dr. Nicholas Lanneman, who is a professor of electrical engineering at the University of Notre Dame, and he's co-director of the Wireless Institute. He's also involved in a very interesting consortia / academic project you may have cause to mention, Spectrum X is, I believe, what it's called, and how that relates to 5G. And batting cleanup for us will be Patrick Welsh. Patrick is the Vice President of Federal Regulatory and Legal Affairs at Verizon, which of course is one of the most prominent advocates for 5G on the carrier side. And we're very interested to kind of hear where the rubber meets the road on these policy issues from a carrier such as Verizon's. So with that, let's turn over to you, Dr. Kubik. Tell us a little bit about your thoughts about 5G and spectrum policy, where we're at now and where we could be going.
Hi, thank you, Drew. Thank you for that introduction. And yes, I've been growing my COVID beard. I'm a year into it right now, so I get called Santa quite a bit, although I can't deliver on all his promises. I'll try to deliver on providing a little bit of understanding on a little bit about what 5G is and how we arrived at where we are and some of the spectrum bands of interest. So when I think about 5G here, I think about probably three primary areas. One is providing ultra low latency to services. This is looking at a 10x improvement in the time to provide services and responses. So over the air, you're looking at a 1 millisecond from a base station to a mobile device latency, and then an end-to-end latency of around 5 milliseconds. A second pillar is the massive IoT. So we knew 10 years ago there was a lot of Internet of Things out there and machine-to-machine communications, and we certainly wanted the technology to support that. So there was a 10 times improvement also in that factor to try to reach a million devices per square kilometer. And finally, as Drew noted, the bandwidth aspect. They were trying to do at least 10x in the user experience bandwidth and 20x in the peak. So really, 100 megabits per second linear coverage of 5G was the target. Really, the end goal to think about there is providing the user with wireless fiber in your pocket. To do that, we had to do a lot of development on technologies. First was antennas, the advanced massive input, massive output antennas provide beamforming. That also led to, implementation initially in the higher bands. As you go higher in frequency, these antennas, say 1,024 element antenna is relatively small. It's about the size of 2 bread loaves. Other improvements had to occur also in the network. There's low latency transport to provide that 5 millisecond end-to-end services. The use of multiple radio access technologies to deliver service. So not only using a 5G, you could use legacy 4G, you could use Wi-Fi, you could use whatever network out there, and that would all provide this high bandwidth. And finally, there's radio improvements that I call fundamental to, I think, all the bands, and that's to improve scheduling of transmissions, use of advanced modulation and coding schemes. So if you look back 10 years ago when we really kicked this off, we believe for 5G to get broad adoption, we had to look at new bands. And that's kind of led us to millimeter waves. At the time, the FCC was getting back a bunch of spectrum in the LMDS band at 28 gigahertz. Those bands were used for fixed wireless services. They had two primary advantages. There was very large bandwidth available. 28 gigahertz had 850 megahertz available in total, so there's easily 100 megahertz or better per user that could be provided there. Industry at the time was using 5 megahertz channels. Second, as I noted before, you could better leverage advanced antenna technologies there. So by 2012, Samsung was able to demonstrate millimeter wave 5G operations at 1 gigabits per second. This is in a fixed environment. using 64 antenna elements. By 2014, we were doing 5G at highway speed. We had a speedway in Korea where we hooked up a subscriber station and a base station on the ground, and we were doing a gigabits per second at 60 megabits per second, or 60 miles per hour. That same network now was doing 7.5 gigabits per second on a fixed basis. So a lot of interest there, and this is where the FCC took over, and carriers really got excited between 2004 and 2018, and led Samsung to actually get our first 5G millimeter wave equipment approved by the FCC. This is our first end-to-end fixed wireless access solution that Patrick may talk about, but this had 1,024 antenna elements in the base station, and if I recall correctly, 64 antenna elements on the user, operating at 28 gigahertz. So that was a great first step, but also around this time frame, everybody was looking at what the advantages of 5G were really able to provide, and believing that we have to expand that into other bands. At the time, the 600 megahertz auction was occurring around April 2017. Around that time, also the initial discussions on opening C-band had been occurring. So between 2018 and 2019, there was a lot of deployment out there and discussions on how to make this happen. And by 2019, Samsung was able to get our first 5G phone approved by the FCC, the Galaxy S10 5G. So we had two variants of that. In April, it was our first millimeter wave device approved for 28 and 39 gigahertz. And then by May, we had mid-band in that band. In those devices, it was a 2.5 to 28 and 39 gigahertz. Of course, that was the initial deployment, and all the carriers really started seeing the advantage of deploying this in their legacy bands as well as looking at new bands. So a lot of work had gone forward on opening C-band. We're now in the process of an auction, just north of $80 billion bid, which is, I find, very amazing. Technology has been moved along very quickly too. And our latest device that we released, the Galaxy S21, supports 11 bands of 5G. So it supports 600 megahertz, 700 megahertz, 2.5 PCS bands for 5G services, as well as something that's very interesting is we're actually supporting C-band now in that product, although there's no network still rented on. It's available in that product right now. So we've done a lot of steps to get the market ready to leverage this. And not only Samsung's very, very active on getting products out there, the global ecosystem is. So as of, this is data from the Global Suppliers Association in February, there's been 588 5G devices out there announced. Across multiple bands, obviously, but a lot of focus is on the mid bands because a lot of the initial deployments in the rest of the world will occur in these mid bands. 365 available devices right now, covering 20 different form factors. So there's a lot of growth here, a lot of activity on delivering on the promise. But I think going back to your original topic, what is the policy we need for growth? Well, first, spectrum is going to be key. Near term, we have to keep focus on C-band and getting that to market in a timely fashion. The auction's underway, but there's clearing that has to occur. I understand from the reports from the C-band operators, they're well along the way on transitioning their satellites, as well as the process of acquiring filters to be sure they're protected from mobile services coming into band. But it's important to keep that on the timeline so we're ready to deploy in those bands. Next, we've got add bands. FCC's got a rulemaking on 345 to 355. That will bring another 100 megahertz there. It'll be very, very key for the next FCC decision here, where they set the rules of the road. Our view is to align that as much as possible to the C-band rules that have already been adopted by the FCC in the higher band. That would probably be the best use of these bands. And of course, what's the next band? New bands are always of importance here. One that's a target is the 3.1 to 3.45 band, noting that that's going to be a more difficult process. It's going to be more intensely shared with DoD type operations, and so it's going to take some time to develop the rules of the road there. but other bands, and we need to continue to feed the appetite for consumers and service providers. And the last item I'm going to talk about is just reducing barriers to deployment. I'll hit this very quickly. One is infrastructure siding. We have to reduce barriers. We got to address the cost of deployed broadband, such as the 5G Rural Fund, and finally, the cost to acquire services and devices. So closing the broadband homework gap, the emergency broadband benefit program is a very important aspect there. Sorry about the long dissertation.
No, it's great. You've definitely laid the table for us, and I want to just ask quickly about the sort of three things you identified at the top: the ultra low latency, the IoT improvements, and the bandwidth improvements. And could you just address that second one? Like, low latency, we understand. Bandwidth, we understand. What are you talking about? Or be a little more specific for our general audience on the massive input, massive output. MIMO is the acronym. What does that mean exactly? What is an improvement there, and how is that going to impact the rollout of 5G, Rob?
So on massive IoT, I think that's just all the devices in your home. I know I'm well connected. I have every vent in my house connected to the network, every thermostat, all my doors connected. So I think just the scope of the connectivity within the home that's needed, but as well as, the machine-to-machine communications to provide, for example, better communications on the road as your car is going down the road to understand what's in front of it, what's behind it, what's coming up soon. So it has that information. So there's a lot of aspects about massive IoT that are very, very important. And they were designing this in 2010 to ensure that need was met. Turning gears a little bit differently on the massive input, massive MIMO. This is basically a technique to have advanced antenna arrays. So, for example, you would have multiple beams coming out from the base station, and it can, to some extent, provide customization to a user over here. They'll get a certain data rate. Another user here will get a certain data rate, as opposed to one big beam trying to provide services there. You can have a lot of advantages there. Now, it varies by bandwidth because of frequencies and laws of physics. And you go higher in frequency, the antennas get smaller, so you'll see a radio at 28 gigahertz, basically about the size of two loaves of bread. We also provide these services as you go lower in frequency, but we can't provide the same number of antenna elements. So, for example, our CBRS product that we have is a 64 transmit and 64 receive product. So it's 64 elements in total there, but it still does a very impressive gains in performance, because when you have these multiple beams coming out, you are essentially using each of those as a multiplier for how much bandwidth can be pushed out from that product. So it's a very important new technology, and you start to see it rolling into lower frequencies.
Well, excellent. Let's get Dr. Lanneman, Nick Lanneman, into the picture here. Tell us a little bit about some of the things that you've been involved in this space, and what it says for, again, the future of spectrum policy for 5G deployment.
Sure, thank you. Hi, everyone. So just again, for some context, I'm a faculty member in electrical engineering, so I have the benefit of being a bit detached from some of these struggles with getting spectrum and getting networks deployed and keeping them operating and secure. But I also get the opportunity to train students to go off and work in this ecosystem, which is getting increasingly exciting because there's just so much going on, right? Robert alluded to it, and actually Drew mentioned it. And about 10 years ago, we created our research center at Notre Dame called the Wireless Institute. And I was teaching a class to a bunch of interdisciplinary class to a bunch of sophomores and talking about the FCC's National Broadband Plan at the time. And so now I can kind of see what has happened since that plan. I did a quick, calculation, including the 600 megahertz auction. There's been about 5.4 gigahertz of spectrum auctioned off, or in the process. And Robert mentioned the C-band auction. Just for context, if you think about a typical LTE or Wi-Fi channel, you might think of them as being about 20 megahertz wide. And so we've gotten 30 more channels over the course of the last 10 years or so. to get that additional spectrum. That's for licensed spectrum. And that's generated about $115 billion in gross bids for the spectrum, which is a considerable amount of money. There's also been an allocation of more unlicensed spectrum, about 1.2 gigahertz of spectrum in the 6 gigahertz band. And although that's primarily oriented at Wi-Fi, it can be used as part of heterogeneous deployments for 5G. So I think many of the original, my observation is that many of the original goals for the broadband plan circa 2010 are being met. Whether or not it's enough spectrum, whether or not, certainly there's debate as to whether or not it's being produced quickly enough. What's been fascinating is that the technology of 5G has really evolved to be able to target much broader industries than, you know, the original connectivity, being able to text and run apps on your phone. So I think it's going to be transforming these industries. There's also been really interesting wrinkles in the way that the spectrum has been repurposed. So we have the TV band incentive auctions. In the 3.5 gigahertz band, the so-called CBRS band, we have this new architecture for spectrum sharing, which is really fascinating. And so from my perspective, the space has only gotten more interesting and intricate. In particular, we have been going up in frequency, trying to get higher and higher frequencies and wider bandwidths. And fortunately or unfortunately, that has caused the cellular ecosystem to kind of collide with other ecosystems that are the incumbent users of that spectrum. And so Robert alluded to
satellite providers, right?
Well, I mean, initially, you know, again, in terms of my 10-year time horizon here, the TV broadcasters were the initial incumbents. That's what got me fascinated with spectrum, is the conversation between the TV broadcasters and little innovators that wanted to use white spaces for something like Wi-Fi back around 2004. Now, in the end, those technologies didn't see the light of day. They weren't approved by the FCC, but the incentive auction produced all this spectrum for cellular in the 600 megahertz band most recently. So that incentive auction structure came about 10 years ago, and that's become more the norm. From the auction point of view, the C-band, there's going to be some of the proceeds from the auction are going to go to the satellite operators as a way of helping them compact and relocate and so on. Similarly, the other really fascinating thing, and I see it as a pretty significant technological and regulatory innovation, is this CBRS band, where the primary incumbent was the Navy radars, which are only, let's say, developed and tested and used for training in the continental United States. But the majority of the United States doesn't have a Navy radar operating in it. You know, South Bend, Indiana doesn't have a Navy radar. And so we can potentially use a pretty sizable chunk of spectrum there for cellular, as long as we protect the Navy use when it needs to be turned on and tested and so on. So CBRS is yet another new model for spectrum use and spectrum sharing. There's some new architectural elements that have come into that picture. And I think the other bands that Robert mentioned, the 345, 31 to 345 band, there's kind of ongoing conversations, as I understand it, between the commercial wireless industry and the defense contractors about how to go about extending the CBRS kind of architecture to accommodate sharing and you know, more efficient coexistence of those systems. So it's been a really fascinating 10 years for us to observe and kind of engage with the industry and train students to go work in the industry. And I don't see it slowing down. I see it picking up in terms of the pace. And so that's pretty exciting from our point of view.
Let me ask a couple of questions to follow up. First, just to check the math here. And it's important to just take a second and break down. I mean, what are we talking about when we talk about these numbers of megahertz, right? The way I like to think about it is, you know, a megahertz is just a measure. It's a unit, which is probably the best one to use. And you just said 20 megahertz is kind of your average channel for an LTE or Wi-Fi, you know, transmission, as you discussed. And then we also kind of use that term to describe a place on the chart, like that is to say 2.5 gigahertz, 3.5 gigahertz, which is 3,500 megahertz, right? So now the math, you said if an average channel is 20 megahertz, I thought you said 5,400 megahertz have been made available. So by my math, that's 260 times over again. So did I miss a number? You said 30 more. I mean, like, which order of magnitude are we talking about here having been added in terms of spectrum made available here?
This may be the classic example of the professor that can't do simple math. I might have just divided 5.4 by 0.2 when it should have been 0.02. So I think your number is right. It's more, it's close to 300x.
That's the point. I mean, it's a large increase. It's a 300-fold increase if those are the numbers, right? And so, you know, is that increase in spectrum necessary for the bandwidth improvements that Dr. Kubik talked about, right? We talked about a 10x improvement on latency, improvement on the input output, a 10 or 20 improvement on bandwidth. Is the spectrum, is there a correlation there, or would you kind of describe those as separate variables, Dr. Lanneman?
Well, my calculation, the 20 megahertz is kind of the original LTE or Wi-Fi channel. Some are 10 megahertz, but 20 is a reasonable number to start with. One of the technologies that has been incorporated into 4G and increasingly in 5G is this notion of channel aggregation. So a given device might use multiple of these channels to convey all of its data. And so when you want to get 100 megabits per second, or maybe even a gigabit per second, those sorts of demonstrations, especially in the lower frequencies, you're using multiple of these channels to give the user that experience.
Okay, well, and the other question quickly before we get Patrick Welsh into this discussion is what you said a moment ago about, I think the word or the phrase is a new framework, a new architecture for spectrum sharing. Could you just elaborate a minute or two more on that? Because we want to talk about spectrum sharing and what that means in different ways that people use that. But for you, what does that mean? What is the new architecture for spectrum sharing about?
Okay, so in the CBRS band in particular, the idea is that you want to have two very different systems use the same band for their applications. So one is Navy radars, which are already designed, deployed, and out there and operating on various ships. The other is, can we move cellular into this band, cellular-like technologies, and have them provide additional broadband capabilities in these bands? And so that set out, I forget exactly when this proceeding started for CBRS, but the FCC said, the actual utilization of this spectrum is so low by Navy radars. It's very important. It happens, again, as the radars are developed at the defense contractors and tested, and then for training purposes at Navy ports. But for the most part, an overwhelming majority of the continental United States is not active with the Navy radar's use. So there are two architectural elements that were added to the system to be able to manage the spectrum and facilitate this sharing. So one is called a Spectrum Access System, or a SAS, SAS. And this idea of a database for access to the spectrum was introduced in the TV white spaces proceeding pretty early on. It wasn't picked up at the time, but it came back in the form of this Spectrum Access System. And the idea is that the cellular system turns on and checks in with the Spectrum Access System to identify a specific channel that it can freely use to provide broadband. So that's one additional element. The other additional element is what's called the environmental sensing capability, or ESC. We communication folks have to have lots of acronyms. I call it acronym soup. The environmental sensing capability for this particular band consists of about 47 sensors deployed along the coastline. They had to be certified by the military, certified by the FCC. These things are scanning for the Navy radars along the coasts. And so when they detect the Navy radar being turned on or tested or for whatever reason operating, they report to the SAS that the Navy radar is operating in a certain region and a certain frequency and so on. And so that clears the spectrum. That tells the SAS to clear the spectrum for that Navy radar so that the cellular system doesn't cause interference. And so again, there's two different use cases, and a legacy system, a new system, and then we added these additional elements to the overall architecture to facilitate more automated spectrum use between these two different?
Wonderful answer. And that I hope kind of gears us up towards the broader points that we want to talk about now. Let's turn to Patrick Welsh to tell us a little bit about your take as to the spectrum policies that have been effective for the United States and what you want to see in them going forward. So, Patrick.
Sure. Thanks, Drew. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Excellent. So, the basis of all of the 4G and 5G networks that we have here really stem from the FCC moving away from the traditional command and control regime of spectrum management, where the FCC set very specific rules and limitations on how spectrum could be used. They were static blocks that were assigned, for a particular purpose, such as broadcast TV or land mobile radio. And really since the 80s, the FCC has moved away from that and embraced more flexibility. And they've done that really in two ways. First, by adopting flexible use licenses that are auctioned off to the highest bidder to ensure that the spectrum is put to its highest and best use. And then the second is the unlicensed regime, where under Part 15, anyone can have access to spectrum using a variety of technologies, so long as they operate at low power levels and don't cause harmful interference to licensed services and accept harmful interference from other services. Those two innovations have really allowed the wireless ecosystem to blossom. And we've seen, as Rob pointed out, the early deployment of 5G focused on millimeter wave bands that were originally assigned for point-to-point links. And the FCC liberalized those views, those rules, and allowed for wide area deployment, so a mobile deployment. But it also gives the flexibility to still use those links, those bands, for fixed links as well. So that kind of flexibility allows network operators like Verizon, AT&T, T-Mobile, to deploy the latest technologies and then to upgrade without having to go back to the FCC and ask for permission. So what we've seen already here with Verizon's network is our initial deployment for 5G began with millimeter wave bands. But we've also started to deploy 5G on our lower spectrum assets through a technology known as dynamic spectrum sharing. So essentially, we can use the same spectrum in, say, our 800 megahertz band for both 4G uses and 5G uses. And this is a huge improvement, both for the network and for customers, because the traditional way of repurposing spectrum was, static refarming, where you segment a band, the band, use a portion of the spectrum for the legacy technology, and then a portion of the spectrum for the new technology. And that really ended up causing a lot of inefficiency. So this new technology allows us to dynamically flex, depending upon the user, which air interface they're going to use. I think the next step in terms of spectrum policy and making sure that we have a robust network, because network operators want to have a mix of different frequencies. You want low band frequencies to provide that broad coverage, so you have a large footprint. You want to have high band frequencies like millimeter wave to provide that massive capacity. We have millimeter wave assets of about 1,700 megahertz on a nationwide basis. That allows us to have, right now 800 megahertz channels, which is just fantastic bandwidth. But one of the downsides to millimeter wave spectrum is that it doesn't propagate as far. And so now the focus has been on making more mid-band spectrum available. And folks have already talked about the ongoing C-band auction, and that's really important. It's 280 megahertz of spectrum, but that really is only kind of a down payment. We have to start thinking of other bands that we can turn to. And clearly the most obvious candidates are the 3.1 to 3.55 band. And there's already an ongoing rulemaking to target the 100 megahertz at 3.45 for flexible use. We're really excited about that. So I think the key for policymakers and legislators is take advantage of the tools we have. We know flexible use works. We know auctions are successful. We know unlicensed spectrum has been very successful. The newer tools to focus on spectrum sharing are really interesting, and we're going to have to spend a lot more time on that. And that's going to be the third path forward. And it really is going to be, as Dave mentioned, mixing commercial applications with federal uses. And that's, we're in the early game of that, but it's really exciting.
So let me add to this discussion the framework, and kind of maybe adopted this years ago when I wrote about the transition to digital television and the basic push to get broadcasters out of the very valuable beachfront property of radio frequencies that they were at. And that, of course, led ultimately to the incentive auction that was first discussed by some of you on here. But just in terms of this paradigm, like just from a common person's perspective, you can think of the airwaves as property, and you can think of it as, this is a person or a company's exclusive use. And you can also think about the airwaves as like a big public park where, there needs to be lots of people able to do whatever they want with it, as long as they, don't emit harmful interference on someone else. And so just speak to us, if you don't mind, Patrick, about how spectrum sharing fits into that. Does it fit in both the exclusive and flexible use framework that you talked mostly about? Does it also fit into the notion of multiple people without licenses making use of particular swaths of spectrum? To talk about that dynamic spectrum sharing capability and whether it applies to both of those and where it needs to go next.
Sure. So I think the short answer is it'll depend on the incumbent systems. For instance, the CBRS band is being shared with Navy radar systems, as we've talked about. Those radar systems are only on between 19 and 24 ships in the U.S. Navy, and those ships are deployed overseas. That spectrum wasn't heavily used here in the United States, so it was relatively easy to work around that. It's going to become much more difficult when we start trying to share with aeronautical radar systems, which is what we'll encounter in the lower 3 gigahertz. And I think trying to find that balance of making sure that we protect the very important needs of federal government, and particularly the Navy or the military, but trying to squeeze as much capacity, though, and use out of that spectrum as possible, and making it available for commercial use. I think most of the time, the federal users will be more comfortable sharing with licensed users, because if there is harmful interference, there's a neck to squeeze. Don't necessarily have that with unlicensed. There was an opportunity in the 6 gigahertz band, which has been made available for unlicensed use, to kind of build off of the traditional, unmanaged Part 15 regime by putting a layer, kind of a control plane, or a layer of coordination called the automated frequency coordinator. It's essentially a lightweight database like the SAS that's used for 3.5. One of the benefits of that is it's kind of a closed loop system that provides feedback so that if there is harmful interference, it's easy to detect and then to mitigate that. So I think we're going to have to, leverage those different technologies in different ways, depending on the incumbent systems. one of the challenges with sharing with military systems is the operational security aspect. DoD doesn't necessarily want everyone to know where they're operating, on what frequencies, and at what times of the day. And so, trying to develop a policy framework that allows the private sector and the public sector to share that information so that we can design these different networks, I think it's going to be critical. And today, there really hasn't been an effective process for that. So I think we're in the early days of that. And that's, I think, going to be a big focus going forward.
Let's get Rob and Nick's perspective on what Patrick said, particularly the issue of spectrum sharing and the licensed versus unlicensed uses. How are we? And let me ask you, Rob, specifically: Are we seeing any unlicensed applications of 5G, or is that kind of not really a thing? Right? Just talk about how the 5G world and the technology set that's out there gets applied to sort of the business and regulatory models.
Sure, we've had multiple models of unlicensed and shared access here. Probably the first one was in the Wi-Fi bands, the DSRC bands, where they share with weather radars in the band. They spent a lot of time back when they did that initial 5 gigahertz allocation, and I was part of that, defining the rules around how the device itself should sense and listen and figure out how to avoid bands. So that was employed in Wi-Fi into also another extent into what's called LTEU unlicensed. You see carriers deploying that as a way to augment their cellular systems via a could be through 5G using multiple radio access technologies that I just talked about ways back. There were some unsuccessful, I would view, activities here. First, one of them was TV white space. I remember being out in the fields around Maryland testing with the FCC to figure out if these devices could listen and hear broadcasters and react accordingly. We did figure that out from a technology standpoint, but I agree with Nicholas. I mean, that was not very successful, and it's not really a full market here. It looks like we're changing the tune a little bit with the CBRS. I think that's a pretty good system. There's a lot of excitement around that. I do recall seeing multiple products out there and a lot of good deployments being considered for multiple uses, not only cellular uses, but for uses such as private networks. So that's a very promising technology. But I do know there's continuing discussions about how to evolve that. Instead of sensing these few radars coming in, well, why not have, for example, the DoD tell us, hey, you need to shut off this area for a certain period of time. So I think these mechanisms are still being developed on how to best access these bands, and hopefully we'll start implementing them and figure out how best to share with these guys, because there is just no spectrum being created, and as you go higher in frequency, it does get more difficult, obviously. Obviously, there's less uses, but if you want to get low band and have good propagation, as Patrick noted, we have to figure out how to resolve and come to solutions here.
Well, even though no new spectrum's been created, it certainly seems like we're making better and better use of it. And the discussion point that you yourself or Dr. Lanneman raised about the number of megahertz that's now available is impressive. Speak to this question, Nick. Would you add anything further to the spectrum sharing and the flexible licensed versus unlicensed or shared uses? What do you see about these different paradigms as applies to 5G and going forward?
I think one thing that's important to note about this example of shared spectrum in CBRS is that in unlicensed, because it's very much a commons, the power restrictions are pretty severe. So you have to transmit, more or less spread spectrum and relatively low power. Because in CBRS, you have a small set of users that are coordinating, smaller set, those deployments from the cellular broadband side can actually transmit with much higher power. So you expand the uses of those networks because you have a different power regime. So I think that's kind of an intermediate point between, I think of it anyway, as an intermediate point between from both a technological side as well as from an economic side. You know, the classic cellular licensed system is exclusive use, pretty high power at the base stations. The classic Wi-Fi unlicensed use is pretty low power, but you don't have to pay for the spectrum. CBRS is in the middle where you can operate at the GAA, General Access Authority, or GAL, I forget the acronyms, but you know, you can operate and set up a network very much like it's a Wi-Fi type network and get pretty rapid access to the spectrum. And that enables these private networks and other kinds of applications. But most recently, there's been priority access licenses that are auctioned off, and you know, at least for a certain part of the band, they get priority use even over the general user. So I see it as an intermediate point, again, from a technology side as well as from a regulatory side. And I would expect that over time, we're going to see more of those intermediate points with these different use cases and different incumbent users that we try to do sharing with.
Now, is it appropriate to focus on the amount of revenue being raised as indicators of how successful you know, these auctions are? I mean, it was alluded that by, I think, Rob, that there's 80 billion in the C-band thus far. The CBRS, though, was viewed by many as a disappointment in terms of money raised. Should we be looking to that as metrics, or by contrast, should we say, no, that's not the metric we want to use? We want to make sure we get the spectrum available to more people. So anyone thoughts on this question? Patrick, go ahead.
I think auction revenue is an important metric. It's not the only metric. Auction revenue is important because that money can then be used by Congress to fund other priorities, and be it, you know, rural broadband deployment or closing the digital divide. It also can be used under the Commercial Spectrum Enhancement Act to go fund to improve and upgrade federal systems to make them more spectrum efficient. And so that kind of creates a virtuous cycle of upgrading older technologies to newer technologies that are hopefully you know, more efficient and spectrum agile. You know, I think at the end of the day, that the key for, you know, determining whether, you know, a particular approach to spectrum allocations is how much it's used. You know, I think CBRS didn't do as well in terms of generating auction revenue because the power levels were artificially low. So it unnecessarily limits the use cases there. So it's much better to have a flexible framework that allows the end user or the licensee to adjust, you know, the power levels or choose the technology based off of their needs.
Well, we saw a question from Scott Slater here, asks exactly what you just alluded to. Do you see the power specs for CBRS changing as it becomes adopted? So anyway, I don't know if Rob, do you want to jump in on that or another point?
Sure, I can jump in on actually both points. You know, I think as we get experience with the CBRS technology out there and the government becomes more understanding of how it works, and granted, we're pretty still in the early stages of it. I think they're concerned with interference. I remember when we went back and did the initial sharing in the Wi-Fi bands, there were some concerns and some resultant interference there. So as we get these systems deployed and become more experienced, I think there's an opportunity to go back and revise those power levels. Will they be higher, such as high power as what, say, the C-band levels are? I don't know if you can reach that level, but could you do 2 dB or 3 dB or 6 dB maybe? Of course, it changes the environment. It changes the sharing environment. Now, if you're in a city, is there spectrum available if you go to 2, 3, 4 times the same power level? And that's something that the policymakers are going to have to address. And just to add on to Patrick's comments on, you know, auctions and things like that, I think there is a minimum baseline that you do set when you look at bringing the spectrum to market and auctioning them. For example, I do recall NTIA put out their estimates for the 3.45 to 355, I think was somewhere north of $13 billion to clear out the federal systems from that band. So I think there is a minimum, guideline you have to look at on auctions raised to help those guys transition out. And of course, the decisions by the FCC of how they bring the spectrum to market will highly influence, how much money is raised in the auction.
Let's also talk about spectrum policies globally and how, because any technology, certainly 5G, is going to have to be a global standard with the global marketplace we're in. How do the U.S. spectrum policies compare with those of Europe and Asia? And what can they learn from us, or we learn from them, or is our world in a state to have that kind of sharing right now, that kind of knowledge sharing right now, or do we just need to make the best of what U.S. approaches are? Patrick or Nick, do you want to take that question first?
Sure. I think we probably the U.S. probably is at the forefront of a more hands-off approach to spectrum management. Again, it's less of a command and control and more of setting very broad technical specifications and allowing licensees to make the deployment decisions. I think that one of the challenges that might be a little bit more unique here in the United States is the bifurcated nature of spectrum management, where the FCC manages non-federal users and NTIA manages federal users. And I think that there are strengths and weaknesses to that. I think there has to be a continued focus on making sure that those two groups work together and get the right balance. We also have a lot more federal use here, specifically DoD, whereas other nations may not. So, I think we benefit from a more liberal approach to spectrum policy, but we do have some drawbacks that other countries don't have.
Nick, what are your thoughts on this? Yeah.
Well, this is at the fringe of my sort of awareness and expertise, but I would say I do think that the additional interactions between the NTIA and FCC seem to slow things down. When you have new ideas for how to repurpose spectrum or share spectrum, you have to go through two regulatory processes and not just one. With that being said, I think the CBRS bands is an example where we have outpaced the rest of the world, where we've made some progress in sharing. And I expect that if we continue to pursue that, we'll continue to lead there, and perhaps we'll start to see some other nation states follow down that path.
I want to come back to something. Please go ahead, Rob. Yeah.
Add on to that on the international aspect. I think it will vary by band. I mean, the FCC in the U.S. was very, very active in the International Telecommunications Union on pushing millimeter wave. And at the time, they, I think, in my view, lost that battle. But other parts of the world are probably ahead of the U.S. on some of the mid bands, such as the C-band spectrum. So the U.S. is now catching up, obviously, with the C-band auction. But you see other places in the world, China, Japan, Korea, where they probably had first movement on some of the C-band deployments, where the U.S. is now catching up. So the mileage will vary on which band you're specifically talking about on how we're pushing forward on 5G.
I want to come back to 2 points that I think were teed up by Rob at the beginning. One is how devices have actually kind of preemptively or sort of proactively included transceiving capabilities in many bands, even if those bands aren't fully functional. And so I wonder if we could speak to, how equipment makers need to anticipate or are anticipating spectrum policy choices. And the other piece of that question, or second question, is back to, you were saying this movement started in 2011, right? So we're 10 years out, 10 years in the making, just kind of early as 4G was really rolling out in the US in those years, 2010, 2011. You're saying 5G was planned. Well, are we planning for 6G and 7G? And what kind of choices, again, focusing on spectrum, what kind of choices need to be made now to anticipate future developments? And let's get all three of your reaction to that.
I'll happily jump in here. So, yeah, we're early in the phase for 6G. We're out there and we're talking about it, and it's very much a research activity right now. Just to put a little rule of thumb in here, when we were first talking about 5G in the 2010-2011 timeframe, Samsung had just put out our first LTE handset. So we're about that same phase. I mean, you're starting discussions, and it probably could take another 5-10 years before we're really at a good framing point for 6G. We're always looking forward to that next technology evolution, because it really drives growth for the industry and moving demand. As far as the trying to anticipate, bands and where they end up, I think we really look to our customers. We have regular meetings with our carriers and understanding their roadmaps and plans for deploying devices and products, and we build to that, along with our partners that are supplying some of the innards of the devices. It's not very often, though, that you see a device coming to market supporting bands that are not yet available. I think this is one of the first times I've seen it was with the C band, but we're also very active on other bands. For example, the same Galaxy S21 supports Wi-Fi 6E, which is one of the first new bands that is open in the 6 gigahertz band for very high wideband unlicensed operations. But sometimes it takes a long time. We're also just trying to deploy ultra wideband in the high frequency 6-7 gigahertz range, which has been a discussion. I'd probably go back 20 years now in ultra wideband. So sometimes it varies by the excitement. It's really driven by what the market is looking to deploy.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Nick, Patrick.
I was just going to say, I think sometimes there are misses, right? WiMAX was a big push on Intel's part. They had integrated chipsets with their processors, and then that ecosystem didn't develop, right? So I'm sure that the calculus that's being done by the device, the handset manufacturers and the base station manufacturers are a little bit different, right? Presumably the base stations can be a little bit more country specific, band specific. The mobile devices have to be a little bit more global. So they probably have to think ahead a little bit more and look at the global landscape. There's economies of scale of not having to spin another chip, right? So adding in a couple of filters and a down converter may not be that costly when you think about the broader economy of scale and not having to have multiple chips for different countries and so on. But I haven't seen that analysis myself, but I'm sure that's the kind of thinking that they do. Great.
Patrick, do you have anything to say on this or other kind of last final thoughts?
Just, I think it's really important to look at global harmonization on bands. That's where you get economies of scale. And I think in the short term, we know that the 3 gigahertz band is going to be a key for 5G. I think we need to look at 4.6 to 4.9. As well as a spectrum in the 7 and 8 gigahertz band. So I think those are kind of the short term. The longer term, I think, is going to probably be higher bands, millimeter wave bands.
Well, wonderful. We're 1 minute out from our end time. I just want to, before closing, thanking our panelists. I want to remind our attendees that we'll be back next Wednesday at 12 noon Eastern time. Our discussion will be on rural innovation, part of our future tools for broadband deployment. We want to especially thank our sponsor for this series on 5G, Samsung Electronics America. It's been a great ride and adventure to cover so many aspects of 5G and the way it impacts the policy questions that we focus on at Broadband Breakfast, and that we know many of you are very focused on too. Please also come to our site more than just every week. Every day we have new content about the key topics concerning better broadband and better lives. With that, and on behalf of Dr. Robert Kubik, Dr. J. Nicholas Lanneman, and Patrick Welsh, I'm Drew Clark with Broadband Breakfast. Thank you for being with us and spending this hour with us this Wednesday. Take care. See you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.